Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, beginning this time with the profoundly mad ravings of another head blob.
Splish, splash. Splish, splash.
Yes, please go on.
Have you heard how curiously the sea churns? Like a storm, but like the rain, only gentle, like dripping water. It bellows from deep inside of me. Here it comes, up through my inside, but gently, like little droplets.
If you say so. But all that talk of dripping reminds me, I'm still on the lookout for brain fluid. So I'll just... Oops, sorry about that, I'll try again. There we go. Don't worry, I'm sure you'll be back to listening to the churning of the sea again soon. Speaking of oceanic sounds, though, I want to take a moment to highlight the importance of the onomatopoeia that constitutes the first thing this NPC says. Now, in and of itself, there isn't anything special about these sounds, but when combined with some of the other dialogues we've heard, they take on an extra layer of meaning. By this point, not only have we found a number of other patients preoccupied with water and the sound it makes, we've actually heard this exact same onomatopoeia before. Back in Translationborne 76, I spoke to an NPC whose lines consisted entirely of two different imitations of water sounds. Well, as it turns out, the head blob we extracted brain fluid from in the last episode called out a variation of the first of these sounds, and just now we heard another take on the second. This holds true for both the English and the Japanese, so either way, if you take the initial lines of the two head blobs and put them in sequence, they end up matching the two sounds made by the patient tending the lumen flower. Combine this with the common obsession with water and the heightened attention to sound we've observed in the other patients, and you get the strong impression that these individuals are accessing a shared aspect of reality. They can't cross-reference the similarities in their mad utterings, but because we can, it makes it seem like there's something out there, presumably a great one, that is influencing these patients' minds to differing degrees, perhaps hindered by a liquid barrier. Incidentally, fans of H.P. Lovecraft's work are sure to notice a strong resemblance here to the opening of The Call of Cthulhu. That story begins with the narrator going through a collection of writings and notes left by his grand-uncle, which document a number of similar visions occurring in people entirely disconnected from one another. These visions have the least effect on ordinary people, make a stronger impression on artists, and also coincide with unusually high amounts of trouble at insane asylums. This ultimately leads to the same conclusion as in Bloodborne, which is that there's a being out there, called Cthulhu, exerting its influence on the human mind. It's a similarity I find worth pointing out because it emphasizes how tying the visions of the research hall patients together, not only implicitly by having them speak of similar things, but explicitly by making them repeat the same onomatopoeia, essentially kills two birds with one stone. In the first place, it builds on our understanding of Bloodborne's world, and in the second, it parallels an important aspect of one of Lovecraft's most famous works, in a way that fits the Soulsborne storytelling style. It makes me very glad that the translators were so attentive to this across all the dialogues we've looked at so far, including lines as basic as plip plop and splish splash. But these water sounds aren't the only things that have received this level of care. Another aspect of these dialogues the translators have done an admirable job with is making the patient sound just the right amount of crazy. A good example of this can be found right in the first intelligible line spoken by the second head blob. As you can see from the comparison with my own literal version, the official English does not follow the wording of the Japanese for this line, but instead takes the core features and reworks them to better effect in English. For example, rather than have this character open with the phrase, "Hey you," which could come off as confrontational, the translators have instead begun with, "Have you heard?" This results in the same direct address to the player as the Japanese, while at the same time keeping the focus of the dialogue on the sound of water. Even more impressive to me, though, is how when the NPC gets to the actual question, the official English frames it in a way that subtly emphasizes the player character's inability to hear the churning of the ocean. A direct translation of the Japanese would be closer to something like, "The sound of the ocean is strange, don't you think?" Which is a reasonably odd thing to say as far as conveying madness is concerned, but it leaves anyone who hears it free to nod along. Even if a player doesn't agree with this statement, they can choose to respect this perspective. The official wording, by contrast, leaves no wiggle room. If the unspoken response to, "Have you heard how curiously the sea churns?" is no, then it's implicitly framed as a perceptual failing on the part of the listener. If the answer is yes, the subsequent lines should make it clear that this patient is hearing things that even someone who initially agreed is unlikely to have any experience with. Either way, players will almost certainly get the sense that this NPC is both mad and uniquely perceptive. Since this fits in perfectly with both Bloodborne's general world building and what's happening in the research hall, I can't help but admire the effectiveness of this specific phrasing. It also serves as a reminder of how well a translation can work when it fits the narrative purpose behind a given set of lines. Still, this approach is anything but easy. The function of a line can be difficult to determine, and even if properly understood, it might be hard to convey, as this next item description can help demonstrate. Firing Hammer Hunter Verification. A hunter verification issued by the Auto Workshop, a faction that became the predecessors of the Gunpowder Warehouse, the heretics of the workshop. Unique concepts and complex mechanisms, and strange weapons. The philosophy of the Gunpowder Warehouse was already alive at this time. Now, as you may have noticed, there's one line of this description that contains two short phrases where the Japanese doesn't specify a subject. Direct translations of these lines result in grammatically incorrect sentences, so the translators have reworked them to include a subject. This is all perfectly reasonable, but the question then becomes, how did they arrive at the specific subject they chose? Well, it's in answering this question where I think doing a deep dive into some potential interpretations will be revealing. To begin at the most basic level, when identifying a missing subject, the thing to do is look at other parts of the surrounding context to find the best fit. At first glance, it seems like there are only two options. It could be the Auto Workshop, since after all this is their badge, or it could be the powder kegs, since they feature prominently in the next sentence. However, when we start to consider narrative intent, I can see a third possibility that calls this entire search for a subject into question. It could be that this central phrase is meant to apply to both factions. After all, as I was just mentioning in the last episode, I believe an important function of learning about the Auto Workshop is to emphasize the generational lineage of the Hunter factions in Bloodborne. Perhaps the best way to highlight this continuity would be to take a different approach to the translation altogether, and use a neutral subject, such as a common goal, to move from talking about one organization to the other. Besides, we've already seen how the few things crafted by the older group fit this definition as well as those created by the newer one. The piercing rifle is optimized for a specific use case, and both varieties of the delayed Molotovs feature complex gadgetry designed to alter the standard use of Molotov cocktails. These are inventions created to fulfill a singular vision, feature complex mechanisms, and they'd probably all be considered strange. Of course, not only are the powder kegs explicitly said to have their roots in the creation of the delayed Molotovs, but the boom hammer, rifle spear, stake driver, whirligig saw, and the cannon all fit the description as well. But speaking of the delayed Molotovs, perhaps the approach taken in those descriptions would work better on the firing hammer badge than merely neutral phrasing. Assuming we've correctly determined that the point of this line is to get at the continuity of the factions, it's worth considering that the best approach might be to identify the characteristics mentioned with the Auto Workshop before then going on to say that the powder kegs philosophy was alive and well. This could demonstrate how the powder kegs originated in the Auto Workshop while mirroring the transition from one group to the next. Don't forget, we've already gotten a motto and a design philosophy for the powder kegs on a different badge. This could be an opportunity to give a similar but unique descriptor to the Auto Workshop. After all, that's the group this badge was meant to identify. Does it really make sense to spend the bulk of the description going over old information about the powder kegs? Shouldn't the Auto Workshop itself be given a specific set of characteristics that help show the connection to their successor organization? Well, in response to that, let's get back to a more linguistic issue. Forget what we think the badge description should say, let's look at the words that are actually there. The final line of this item description is inarguably about the powder keg's philosophy. But what exactly is that philosophy? It's kind of odd to allude to that purely on another item, especially when there's a good summation of how the powder kegs operate right here. Singular ideas, intricate designs, and strange weapons. When parsing these last two sentences as a whole, doesn't it make the most sense to see it all as applying to the powder kegs? As for the information about the Auto Workshop being the organization that led to the powder kegs, that's already stated in plain text in the opening line of this description. After that, it only seems fitting to elaborate on how the powder kegs' methods and ideology were already established in the time of the Auto Workshop by focusing on things that define the later organization. In other words, this approach offers the most cohesive take on the final two lines as a whole, while still satisfying the basic narrative role we've identified. As you've probably already realized, though, the real point is that each of these interpretations has something to be said for it. Beyond that, each one satisfies, in one way or another, the narrative intent of tying the Auto Workshop and the powder kegs together. So even knowing the role this item description is meant to fulfill, it's not entirely clear the best way to go about it. Often in creative work, you'll need to consider several different correct answers and choose the one you think is best. This can lead to some tough decisions, and sometimes the approach you favor can change from one reading to the next. In this case, I ultimately agree with the approach the official translators took. I do think identifying the powder kegs as the subject of the second to last line of the Japanese is the most cohesive approach. Looking at the item description as a whole, the variant lines I considered felt like they shifted subjects too much, and it does make sense to me to include the powder kegs in a summation of their own philosophy. However, that's not to say I wouldn't also be okay with those other approaches, particularly the neutral option. Of course, I don't really know whether the translators considered any of these alternative approaches, but I still think the various options for this particular line do a good job demonstrating some of the issues with translating based on narrative purpose, as well as the potential for difficult choices required by creative works. I also wanted to be sure to point these things out now, because they're going to be directly relevant to some of my thoughts on this next dialogue with Simon. Hey there, buddy. This place is miserable, don't you think?
Oh, hello. Not a pretty sight, is it? The true face of the blood-worshipping, beast-purging, healing church. But that's not all. You seek the secrets held by the nightmare, do you not? Then here's what you must do. Climb the astral clock tower and kill Maria. She hides the real secret.
What? But she sounds so nice.
Go on. Kill Maria atop the astral clock tower. She hides the real secret.
So, for the most part, this translation fell in line with my expectations, but Simon's final bit of dialogue surprised me. That's because the official English phrasing not only makes Maria out to be a more active participant in hiding the Healing Church's secrets than I would have expected, but it's also not as clear about what the player's ultimate goal should be. Literally, the subtitles simply conclude by telling us that the real secret of the Hunter's nightmare lies beyond where Maria can be found. When I first saw this, I had mixed feelings about the English being such a strong statement by comparison. On the one hand, the official translation fits with Simon's previous command to go kill Maria, and as we'll see, it actually reflects the truth of the situation. On the other hand, though, it makes the events surrounding the confrontation with Maria more confusing, since when we find her, it appears like she's already dead. Without knowing that we should be looking for a way to physically progress further then, it might seem like the thing to do is talk to Simon again, rather than search her corpse, which is how we actually move forward. However, given more time to think about why this line is the way that it is, I realized it's important to keep in mind that the context it was translated in was probably different than what we see in the game. What makes me fairly sure of this is a video by Lance McDonald, who is able to discover fully voiced lines that have been cut from the game. These suggest an entirely different set of interactions between the player character, Simon, and Maria. You can watch that video for yourself either by following the link that should be popping up in the upper right hand corner, or by clicking on the one in this video's description. To provide a summary of the most crucial points though, the way this back and forth seems to have been initially conceived is that after being told to kill Maria, the player character would have found her still alive in the clock tower. If they decided to speak with her, she would try to persuade them to return to the hunt. The player character could then talk to Simon again, and he would scoff at their naivety. At that point, if the player character didn't kill Maria themselves, Simon would do it, and Maria's fake corpse would have different dialogue if interacted with, depending on who did the killing. In this context, all of the downsides I saw in the official English translation of Simon's last line disappear. Maria herself tries to persuade the player character to leave the nightmare, so Simon's implication that she's actively hiding the church's secrets is even more justified than it is in the game's final build. Furthermore, the comparative lack of clarity as to how to proceed gets resolved as well, because not only is Maria alive to interact with, but if you talk with her enough, she herself implies that to tease more from the depths of the nightmare would require her murder. Of course, this entire scenario was ultimately abandoned, but because of how far it seems to have gotten in production, I think it remains relevant for how this dialogue was phrased. Remember, these lines were fully voiced, which is significant because, as you may know, voice actors are expensive. As a result, they're often only brought in for a set amount of time on video game projects, and once they're done recording their lines, that's usually it. So, after Simon's voice actor recorded that set of translations, it became exceedingly unlikely that they would change. This is also where I think it's helpful to return to the point I was making earlier about the possibility of multiple correct translations in a creative work. Because while I was surprised at the official English version of Simon's final line, that doesn't mean it's not a perfectly reasonable option. Even if, for example, the line could have been changed to something like, "The real secret lies deeper still," that would have come with its own drawbacks. After all, by de-emphasizing Maria's active role in hiding the secret, it makes Simon's injunction to kill her seem less warranted. And the fact is, she's a boss we have to beat if we're going to make further progress through the DLC. Also, while I do think this change would make things a little less confusing when we find her presumably dead, I don't know if it would be so much clearer that people would better understand the need to search her false corpse. So if you've got a line that's perfectly functional as recorded, and there's only a minor benefit to updating it at potentially great cost, why change it? Ultimately, even setting aside my speculative considerations of how this line may have been shaped by development, the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. Of course, you're free to come to your own conclusions as to how you feel about this or anything else in the episode. And as I start to wind things down, I would encourage you to share those or any other comments, questions, or suggestions you might have for me. Your feedback is always appreciated. Finally, remember that if you're looking to hear my thoughts on any particular subject I've covered so far, the Translationborne index linked below should be updated within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.